Шановне панство, вітаю вас на симпозіум сьогоднішній на честь 150-ліття наукового товариства імені Шевченка. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you today. My name is Markian Dovchansky, and I work at the University of Illinois at the European Union Center, and I'm a historian by training. I'm also a member of MTSHA, and we have convened a distinguished group of scholars today representing fields of literary studies, history, and political science. The title of the symposium is about as contemporary, relevant to contemporary issues as one could hope, Ukrainian scholarship in light of the Russian war on Ukraine. And I'm going to introduce each of the speakers very briefly because they're no doubt well known to most of you.
The mic needs to be
Closer, yeah. Okay. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel. I'm going to introduce the speakers individually, and then I'll give the floor over to them. So the Shevchenko Society in the US, just as the original society founded 150 years ago, has always been tasked with formulating scholarly and intellectual responses to existential questions confronting Ukrainian society. The outbreak of the current Russian war on Ukraine has galvanized our members to a remarkable degree as they shared their expert knowledge on all fronts. As the war grinds towards its third year, this panel has been convened to examine our respective academic disciplines and see what progress has been made in both discourse and institutional structures, and specifically what next steps would be most effective. So our speakers today include Vitaly Chernetsky, who is a professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Kansas. And his talk is called Confronting Epistemic Injustice, Why Centering Ukraine in Humanities and Social Science Research is an Urgent Imperative. Our second speaker is Susan Smith-Peter, who is a professor of history and director of the Public History Program at the College of Staten Island, City University of New York. And her talk is called How the Field Was Colonized, Russian History's Ukrainian Blind Spot. Our third speaker will be Oksana Shevin, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University, and her talk is called Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. And our fourth speaker is George Grabovich, who is the Dmitro Chizhevsky Research Professor of Ukrainian Literature at the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Harvard, and his talk is titled, Is Cancel Culture the Answer to Russia's War on Ukraine? And so our first speaker is Dr. Chernetsky, so I'll turn the floor over to him.
Good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. Thank you for coming here and for joining us for this panel. I have a PowerPoint which hopefully will help us navigate things. My hope and purpose in doing this today is to help all of us have a critical vocabulary when we are certainly the ones who do not need convincing that studying Ukraine, centering Ukraine in research, teaching, and other activities is hugely important now. But this would help us in dealing with the arguments with some others, including potentially not friendly and charitable others who would want to question why Ukraine matters. And the paradigm of critical epistemology that is looking critically as to how knowledge is generated, how knowledge is structured, who gets to participate and who gets excluded deliberately, accidentally, through individual efforts or through structural issues, is at the center of it all. As we remember very well, this point over a year and a half ago, when Russia's full-scale invasion began, for a lot of Western pundits and experts, this was a foregone conclusion that Kyiv would fall in 3 days, that current Ukrainian state was gone and done for. Earlier than that, the Russian government's talking point about Ukraine as a failed state were being widely shared and discussed, and it almost became an accepted idea in many analytical circles. And obviously, as we know, Ukraine has consistently defied the international experts' expectations, even now in very difficult times when military and financial aid to Ukraine unfortunately has become a political issue, and Vladimir Putin and some of his minions in Russia trying to do a happy dance about it. We still see Ukraine staying resilient and fighting very hard and continuing to defy those negative expectations. And one of the biggest outcomes of the time was that many folks in the global expert community had to admit that they knew and understood very little about Ukraine, and they did, in fact, had a habit of uncritically recycling the stereotypes and talking points that they've absorbed, and that many of them were of Russian imperialist origin. And they needed to admit, they were compelled to admit that there's a history of marginalizing Ukrainian studies within the broader field and of ignoring or dismissing Ukrainian voices as somehow marginal, not relevant, not having anything of value to contribute. In other words, what we had was a combination of two related factors: epistemic injustice and epistemic violence. The failure to understand Ukraine, to appreciate its concerns, testify to the existence of an entrenched pattern of epistemic injustice towards Ukraine, and I will unpack this term further. And at the same time, the Russian military assault against Ukraine was prepared for and is continued to be accompanied by a campaign of epistemic violence against Ukraine. So very real physical violence is accompanied by epistemic violence. So I will try to unpack those terms and help us understand why this is a good approach, in my opinion, and hopefully you will find this a useful toolkit in discussing why Ukraine matters. So a little bit on the concept of epistemic injustice. It is a field of inquiry situated at a cross-connection between political philosophy, ethics, and epistemology. And again, epistemology is how knowledge happens, where knowledge comes from, and how it is organized. And it owes its growth and development especially to feminist philosophical inquiry, but also to scholarship on race, class, sexuality, disability, and other issues. But yes, it was feminist philosophers back in the 1970s and 80s who pioneered what later would lead to this. A major development of the field, the milestone, was the publication of a book by the British philosopher Miranda Fricker, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. And she now teaches here in New York at NYU, so we have this founding expert, just a few blocks away from us. And later on, there was a comprehensive Routledge Handbook of Epistemic Injustice, which brought a diversity of perspectives. And my friends and colleagues in the departments of philosophy say that this is one of the hottest growing sort of areas of development of contemporary philosophical discourse. So where, again, a little bit on the roots. So as I said, feminist philosophy, Sandra Harding and her idea of standpoint epistemology, in her books, The Science Question in Feminism and Whose Science, Whose Knowledge, and Donna Haraway's concept of situated knowledge, formulated in response to Harding. So in other words, knowledge never happens in a vacuum. A person who goes from not knowing to knowing, and who's sharing their knowledge with other people, is an embodied person situated in a specific time and place, and they have their background, and those backgrounds are not irrelevant. And Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, another luminary who is based a little further uptown in Morningside Heights, spoke of epistemic violence in her very influential article that changed a lot of contemporary humanities, and it's the article Can the Subaltern Speak, back in 1988. So Fricker, in her book, identifies two types of epistemic injustice. One she calls testimonial injustice. And that's when a prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's world. And her examples are a testimony of victim of sexual assault in a sexist society, or a black person's testimony in a racist society. And she actually does look at Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird and shows that what is shown in that novel, how the black person is treated by the old white jury, is an example of that testimonial injustice. They could not, because of their prejudices, but also because of how the system was organized, to give that person their words, the knowledge he was trying to share, the level of credibility that deserves. So there is a prejudice in the economy of credibility. And then there is an extension of that, preemptive testimonial injustice, when a silencing happens because of structures of social power within institutions of learning. And this is something that those of us in Ukrainian studies have encountered time and again, that a lot of fields in which we operated in the humanities and in the social sciences made it structurally impossible even for a Ukrainian voice, a Ukrainian perspective to be visible, to be recognized as something of value. And then a different aspect is what she calls hermeneutical injustice. When there is, we all have these collective interpretive resources in our society. That's how we make sense of the world around us. And there can be a gap in these resources that puts someone in an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their own social experience. And the example she gives, a person experiencing sexual harassment in a culture that has still not developed a concept of what sexual harassment is and why it is bad. So it is caused by structural prejudice in the economy of collective interpretive resources. And again, this is something that will be familiar for us, those folks focusing in Ukraine, when, yes, you cannot quite make sense as to discomfort you feel, why the knowledge system that you're being initiated into through your education, through socializing within academia, does not hear you, does not speak you, and you cannot make sense of why are you being marginalized and shut out. And so this is structural prejudice in the economy of collective interpretive resources. So since there's injustice, there has to be corresponding virtues. So the virtues that Fricker proposes are testimonial justice, and that is influence of identity prejudice on the hearer's credibility judgment is detected and corrected for. So a hearer, in other words, a person with whom something is being shared, says, aha, I may be predisposed to discount what this person is trying to say to me. Why am I doing that? Should I make an extra effort to make sure that I understand that person? And then hermeneutical injustice, and here I'm quoting Fricker because she put it so well, you have to be alert and sensitive to the possibility that, quote, the difficulty one's interlocutor is having as she tries to render something communicatively intelligible is due to not it being a nonsense or her being a fool, but rather to some sort of gap in collective hermeneutical resources. The speaker is struggling with an objective difficulty and not a subjective failing. In addition to these two aspects that Fricker identified, another philosopher, Gail Polhouse Jr., proposes a third type of epistemic injustice, which she calls willful hermeneutical ignorance. And what Gail says, and Gail happens to be a friend of mine, a professor of philosophy at Miami University in Ohio, where I used to teach, a knower situatedness and interdependence create the situation where there is a tension which may lead to the expansion of possible knowledge, but also can lead to a new form of epistemic injustice. Willful hermeneutical ignorance does not describe a thwarted epistemic agent, as the black person testifying in front of the jury in the trial in To Kill a Mockingbird. who is not believed or cannot make sense of her world. Instead, it describes instances where marginally situated knowers, like us, people in Ukrainian studies, actively resist the epistemic domination through interaction with other resistant knowers, while dominantly situated knowers, the mainstream in the field, the Russocentric part of the field of Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies, nonetheless continue to misunderstand and misinterpret the world. It is, as Gale puts it, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and globalized cognitive dysfunction. And this is simultaneously an agential and a structural injustice. So, sorry for a very busy slide. What I'm just going to say is that the important point here is that a marginally situated knower, like a Ukrainian studies specialist in the broader field of studying the former Russian Empire and the former Soviet bloc, is more likely to find gaps in the predominantly held epistemic resources. And marginalized knowers must be aware of the concept of those who are vulnerable, but these dominantly situated knowers need not necessarily do that. And we have in American society W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness of a black person in a white-dominated society who has to be aware always of the perspective of the dominant. And within Ukrainian context, Oksana Zabushko, one of Ukraine's leading contemporary writers and public intellectuals, spoke about this very powerfully at a conference at Rutgers University back in 1992, which was the first time a Ukrainian writer was actually invited to contribute to a major international forum like this, because to the previous one, like the famous Lisbon conference, where there was a big confrontation between Central European writers like Czesław Miłosz and Danilo Kish, and Russian writers with an unlikely alliance of Joseph Brodsky and Tatiana Tolstaya, who denied the imperial character of Russian culture. They did not even occur to them that Ukrainians should be invited and they might have anything to contribute. So Zabushko's presence at that conference in Rutgers was a major breakthrough. It was a last-minute afterthought, and she realized that she had a chance and she needed to break through and speak to those people using not just Ukrainian material, but bring in other analogies. And so she offered the perspective of a Yiddish language writer in Yiddish literature. She talked about Jakob Gladstein, who is a major modernist poet in Yiddish, who is also the Yiddish translator of T.S. Eliot. And his famous saying was, I need to know about T.S. Eliot, but T.S. Eliot does not necessarily need to know about me. But Zabushko continued, too bad for T.S. Eliot, because Gladstein is somebody who has more knowledge, and more knowledge is a good thing. Being ignorant, not needing extra knowledge, is not necessarily a good thing. However, what happened, and this is also what Sandra Harding talked about in her feminist approach to philosophy of science, that being marginally situated leads not to different knowledge, but to more objective knowledge. So you have a multiplicity of perspectives, you are experience rich, and you're therefore more able to reflect more of the experienced world in general. But a person in a dominant position can take an interest in how the world is revealed to those from marginalized experiences. And through this, they can participate in what Harding calls a critical standpoint. In other words, ignorance is not something one is doomed to because of social position, but rather something one chooses to maintain. So just because you're part of a dominant group, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It means that you need to be critically aware and reflexive of where you are and what kind of knowledge position you have and how you can engage with others to make your experience richer. And other philosophers have built up on that. Christy Dodson, who is a professor at the University of Michigan, her theory is that epistemic injustice is a subset of epistemic oppression, so she goes to a system approach. So there may be a type of epistemic exclusion that we have not yet identified, and so epistemic oppression for her is when we have persistent epistemic exclusions that hinders people's contribution to knowledge production. And this is, again, something those of us in Ukrainian studies are very familiar with. Epistemic exclusion, and she's being a good analytical philosopher, defining one through another, is an unwarranted infringement on the epistemic agency of knowers. An epistemic agency is the ability to utilize persuasively shared epistemic resources within a given epistemic community in order to participate in knowledge production and, if required, the revision of those same resources. And this is what people say why Dodson's model may be more productive than Fricker's, even though Fricker's came earlier. Fricker's model takes the perspective of those who potentially do harm and who allows them to not do harm, and it moves away from the perspective of those who are targeted by the harms of epistemic injustice and oppression. So Fricker's focus on how to be a good knower versus how to contend with the harm already done, while Dodson's framework uses a systems approach, focuses on epistemic agency and exclusion. And then she looks at, again, as analytic philosophers do it, first order, second order, and third order exclusions. First order is inconsistency how the system is utilized or run. And preemptive testimonial injustice, when there's no room for somebody to contribute, is an example. Second order, a system needs to be more fully developed to facilitate epistemic agency more equitably. And Fricker's hermeneutical injustice would be an example of that. But then Dodson says that there could be a third order exclusion. An entire system is inapt for attending to epistemic interests of particular knowers, and so a new epistemic system is needed. It brings into focus how epistemic system can actively and not just passively do harm, and therefore all the calls that we have now for decolonizing our field means that decolonizing epistemology, how knowledge is produced and systematized, is urgently needed. And then there's a related notion of epistemic exploitation. And that's, again, something those of us, like people in Ukrainian studies who are marginally situated within the dominant field, are very much familiar with. The term epistemic exploitation was proposed by Nora Berenstein. And that is when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to produce an education or explanation about the nature of the oppression they face. In other words, the burden is, for us, for example, in Ukrainian studies, to explain to the people who are dominantly situated in the broader field why they need to pay attention to Ukraine. So marginalized persons are manipulated to spend time and energy on this labor rather than on other pursuits that might be more beneficial for them. They're also placed in a double bind, having to choose between allowing ignorance and false claims about marginalized people like ourselves to go unchallenged, or providing epistemic labor that is doing the explaining, with the knowledge that it is improbable that the dominantly situated knowers will change their understanding and will refuse to treat their knowledge claims and ways of knowing as legitimate. We've had this so much as when Western experts can be trusted. Ukrainians are too close, they're too emotional, they cannot think rationally, so they can be objects or they can be witnesses, but they cannot be analysts that we trust. This is something that we have encountered quite a bit. Another related notion, epistemic imperialism. So the standpoint of the privileged, the experience and standards are constructed as normal and neutral. And here, Gail Polhow's concept of a wrongful request to understand comes into play. When dominantly situated knowers ask marginally situated knowers to take on the ways of understanding that are grounded in the experience of the dominantly situated and disavow their own is a subset of that. In other words, a white person in antebellum South is not at fault for being racist. It's just that the education that they received, they had no choice but to be racist. That's what happened. And you have to understand them and therefore forgive them for that. And similar things have been adduced about the imperial aspects of Russian culture, both within the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. They can't help but telling those racist, jokes about Ukrainians and Chukchi, others, and using ethnic slurs. That's the culture they've been, brought up in. They hear those slurs and they see them on the pages of 19th century classics. So of course they think that this is okay. So it is not okay. This is the wrongful request to understand, as Gail Bauhaus terms. So how do we get to changes? Let's look at Fricker. Change begins at home. Starting with oneself is not a bad approach. So this is what we can tell our friends, interlocutors, and our potential future friends if they're willing to listen. You need to have reflexive critical awareness of the likely presence of prejudice. If you think that you may have some kind of prejudice, and this applies to all of us, this should lead to active critical reflection. And as Fricker says, there is no clear algorithm here, but there is a clear guiding goal. If you have a guiding goal, you'll do well. And what she also calls for the creation of more inclusive hermeneutical microclimate between hearer and speaker that would overcome the effects of hermeneutical marginalization. So create the exchange microclimate, and again, the onus is on the dominantly positioned to make an effort. And Gail Bauhaus talks about epistemic agency and oppression. Again, system approach is crucial for understanding epistemic harm associated with colonization, among other things. Structures of oppression frame knowers from within the oppressing class as ideal capable knowers, and knowers from the oppressed class as less able or incapable. So is it enough to just correct an individual within the system, or is the whole system in need of recalibration so that it cannot be misused? We need, Bauhaus argues, to shift away from solutions that rely on individuals to self-correct and towards changes that prevent testimonial exchange from being discounted based on identity prejudice on the structural level. So there are exclusions, and people who have been excluded are uniquely positioned to identify gaps in the system. And individual knowers can only do so much, so we need to change the system. There is also a problem of exploitative inclusions, the kind of epistemic imperialism. Call upon others to do the labor, but then not listen to them. It's the de dicto inclusion and de re exclusion. Prove to me that racism and sexism are real, says a person who does not believe in them. Or to many of us in the Ukrainian community, and this is something that I experienced very soon after coming to this country, when a wide-eyed graduate student, happy to learn more about knowledge not restricted by the ideological dominance of dogma of the Soviet Union. All of a sudden, I encounter a person at this well-meaning sort of academic party who says, "Oh, hi, I hear you're Ukrainian. I know that all Ukrainians are anti-Semites. Prove to me that you're not an anti-Semite."
Yes, you are.
So that when you are confronted with that kind of projection, I mean, I was, this young person who, got tongue-tied, my blood pressure spiked. And this person did not, prejudge me, prejudge my background, prejudge my views, and did not even give me a way to encounter things. It did not even occur to that person that some Ukrainians are Jewish. And that, in my case, I lost family members. I'm not Jewish myself, but I have Jewish family members by marriage, including my grandmother's first husband, who perished in the Holocaust, the dad of my father's older brother, and this was incredibly traumatizing. And it is unfair and horrible that this continues to be exploited, including by the Putin regime, including when Ukraine now has a Jewish president, and the same old, tired talking points are being trotted out. And this is something that we need to very resolutely confront. And another very important thing, this is horizontal versus vertical directionality of work. Raising awareness of the dominant is not enough. We need to find allies, so going and encountering others. And this is what Argentinian philosopher Maria Lugones emphasizes. I believe she was associated with Stony Brook, so it's all people not too far from New York City. So what is other part of Roadmap for Changes is finding decolonial epistemic practices and practicing solidarity. We need to go across borders. Does not mean that borders do not exist and they need to be ignored, but we need to be able to work across them and democratize the learning experiences. So, big thesis. For too long, Russian imperial gaze was internalized by Western academia, and therefore, to dismantle imperial legacy, we need to leave the comfort zone, be proactive in efforts to unlearn and then relearn. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a great African writer, in his book Decolonizing the Mind, said that their imperialism brings a cultural bomb to annihilate a people's belief in their names, their languages, their environment, their heritage of struggle, and their unity, and their capacity, and ultimately in themselves, something that Ukrainians are very much familiar with. Colonialism, cultural control is they dominate the mental universe of the colonized through culture, to how people perceive themselves in their relationship to the world, a deliberate undervaluing of people's culture. And so in decolonizing ourselves, in decolonizing our field of knowledge, we look for liberating perspective within to see ourselves clearly in relationship to ourselves and other selves in the universe. So this decolonization through liberating perspective is what I'm calling us for. Decolonization, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Young tell us, is not a metaphor, is an actual hard work. As Selby Durdeev, a wonderful Central Asian scholar now based in Germany, Russia, emphasized in a recent brilliant article, Russia is not a decolonial ally, as they try to instill the belief amongst many people in the global South intellectual elites. And we have another wonderful project by another Central Asian duo of colleagues, Bodakos Kasembekova and Erika Marat, on Russia's so-called imperial innocence, projecting that Russia is an innocent empire, a good empire, and therefore it should be treated differently from other historical colonial empires. So where is Ukraine in all of this? We know that in most of the Western intellectual elites for far too long, Ukraine has been small on their mental maps. We can counteract the epistemic violence that is part of the current Russian aggression by addressing epistemic injustice in regard to Ukraine and our academic environments. And we need to bring about an epistemic paradigm shift regarding Ukraine and the broader region. And here are some minimal things that I think we all can agree on. We need to recognize and confront an entrenched anti-Ukrainian prejudice within academia. We should not approach this as a temporary problem in need of a temporary solution. And we need to recognize that returning to the status quo ante is impossible. We need to create resources for and encourage the pursuit of and studies of Ukrainian language and culture. And not only in literature, but across all the arts. And as some people here know, and here 3 cheers to Solomia Ivachiv, classical music is another example of enduring problematic exclusion. We need to tell our colleagues and encourage them to seek out Ukrainian readings on global, regional, comparative, and theoretical topics. Ukrainians have something important to contribute, not only to things that are narrowly Ukraine-focused. Classic example. Taras Shevchenko's Kafkaz, which was written in 1845, is a pioneering articulation of anti-colonial solidarity of the oppressed. Борітеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає was not addressed to Ukrainians, was addressed to the indigenous population of the Caucasus fighting against Russia's imperial war of capture. To think about Lesya Ukrainka as an outstanding feminist writer of global relevance. To think about Ivan Zuba's Internationalism or Russification, available in English now for 55 years, as a dissident Marxist critique of Russian imperialist features of the Soviet project. We need to make sure that Ukrainian artists and intellectuals are not mislabeled as Russian. And we've seen changes happen in a lot of museums, but it's not just a matter of museums, it matters a lot of other aspects of culture. That Ukrainian history should not be subsumed as a minor branch within supposedly broader Russian history. And here the recent efforts of the Library of Congress, and I salute Yuri Dobzhansky and his colleagues' work on that, reorganizing the classification of history scholarship is a huge accomplishment. And we need to tell our friends, and hopefully future friends, to listen to Ukrainian voices, and to understand that the work of undoing any ignorance and unconscious biases on their part is not the Ukrainians' burden, but theirs. We need to be respectful and responsible in the inquiries, and do not re-traumatize those who have already been heavily traumatized. Most importantly, practice solidarity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chernetsky, for the analytical and programmatic way to kick off our symposium. Our next speaker is Susan Smith-Peter, and you may be wondering, given Vitaly's presentation, how this all came to be. And Dr. Smith-Peter has one way of answering that question, and the title of her talk is How the Field Was Colonized, Russian History's Ukrainian Blind Spot.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. Thank you, Morgan, for that introduction, and thanks to Helena for inviting me. So in this talk, which I have to give off the cuff because I sustained some water damage to my computer, so therefore there may be some specifics that I don't remember. But in any case, in this talk I want to focus on two particularly important moments, two moments of when the field was colonized. The first moment took place at Moscow University in the 1860s and 1870s. And this is a moment where we first see a person who I think is tremendously influential up to the present day in the field of Russian history. And when I talk about Russian history, Russian historians, I'm mainly going to be defining that as Russian history as practiced in the United States. And when I say Russian historians, I'm really going to be talking about American historians who are working on the history of Russia. So at that particular moment, it was a moment, of course, of, around the time of the Great Reforms, 1861, the end of serfdom. It was a moment of a lot of uprising and upheaval. And at Moscow University, which was one of the leading departments of history, there was a lot of discussion about what was going on and how to understand Russian history. And one of the things that's sort of easy to forget at that moment is that there were many quite prominent interpretations that later became far less prominent. And these are the populist historians, Shapov, for example. There were a whole raft of regionalist historians. There were many people who were talking about the need to go back to the Republic of Novgorod. There were people who were talking about that Russia had a hidden democratic history. And at this time, this was all being discussed. There was also a series of student uprisings and rebellions that took place. And this is the moment when Vitaly Chernetsky is looking at everything that's going on. And Chernetsky is someone who comes from a clerical background. He was not from a wealthy background. That's sort of basically two different ways of saying the same thing. But he came to Moscow University. He had great gifts of many kinds, which I'll talk about later. One of the things that's really striking is how much he rejected everything that was questioning the kind of status quo. Now, sometimes he would indeed talk about, the state grew fat and people grew lean and that sort of thing. But if we're looking at the question of authority. He did have a tendency to side with those people who were in authority. And this also is tied to his dislike of those student rebellions, and a sense that the people who were telling histories that did not focus on the through line of the state were not really being serious. And this kind of ties in with what Vitaly was just talking about. There's a kind of, the state is serious and reasons of the state are serious. Other kinds of considerations are not seen as quite as serious. And of course, in the early 1960s, Chernetsky was just a graduate student. He was working, he had to deal with his advisor, who was not always an easy person to work with, but over time he became a very famous professor, a famous author, and his view of history, which he did take in many ways from his advisor Solovyov and influences from Karamzin as well, that view of history became dominant for many years, and in some ways even now up to the present. And this, of course, is, Kievan Rus, Muscovy, Peter the Great, Imperial Russia, and then it's relatively easy to just tack on USSR after that. So when you look at Chernetsky and when you look at what he argues in terms of the through line of history, it is quite interesting, because you have this double act there, where you have to have the history of the state and you also have the history of the people. From his point of view, in many ways those were almost the same, even though he was also a believer in autocracy. So we have these various kind of tensions. But for him, the agent of history was the Russian people. He would have said the great Russian people. And they were the state-bearing people from his point of view. And when you have that point of view, you also have these other exclusions, such as you're excluding Ukrainians, you're excluding Belarusians. I'm not going to go through the list, it's a long list. But from that point of view from Moscow, you can present yourself as, being the serious person, right? Being, again, from the dominant position. And those people who are not from that are sort of not from, are not as serious. In some ways, I think of Chernetsky as sort of the Johnny Carson of historians, because, he was really able, because he was so cool and so sharp, he was able to make other people seem faintly ridiculous, right? Even if it wasn't exactly fair, he was just able to present things in that kind of way. His lectures were so brilliant that they were like standing room only often. People would come from all over Moscow, and he would just get up and he would talk, and he would give this tremendously powerful view of Russian history from the point of view of the state, and with the Russian people as the mover of that state. If we think of academia as a sort of academic struggle for ideas, sort of in a Darwinian sense, the person who has the most students wins, right? The person who has the most students wins. And Chernetsky had a tremendous number of students. He had a tremendous number of students. Now, some people have argued, well, he only had, I think it was 13 people who became PhDs under him. But from students, I also mean people who were in his classrooms, who may not have, gotten their degrees from him, their actual dissertation with him, and people whose views of history were shaped by him, and those included like Tsar Alexander III and Nicholas II, so people with some influence in the world. Even though he was not always a warm and fuzzy person with his students, he still was able to give a real sense of loyalty. There's a sense when you look at this process that the people who studied under him had a tremendous amount of loyalty, and that view was the view from Moscow, right? And as many of you are aware, his argument was that colonization was really the most important thing in Russian history. Now, so far that sounds good, but the way he understood colonization was a peaceful process by which the great Russian people absorbed all other peoples. And for his point of view, that was a good thing, right? So you do have that kind of sense of, the view from the center, very much, the view from those in power. This view actually was widely shared, and among those students were three people who came to the United States after the Bolshevik Revolution, and I want to focus on one of them in particular, and that is Michael Karpovich. And this brings us to the second moment of the talk, which took place at Harvard after the war, after World War II. So, before the war, Russian history had been taught at a variety of places by a variety of people, but there had not been an ability to create a cadre of students, right? Because either the person was absolutely impossible as a human being, like Droid Robinson, or just because there wasn't enough money or there wasn't enough interest. But after World War II, it became very clear that it was important to understand the Soviet Union, and there was a lot of money that was given. And Karpovich was given the ability to teach Russian history on a large scale at Harvard. And there was a large number of students who took classes and who got their PhDs. And Karpovich always remained faithful to the overarching view of Kluchevsky. And Kluchevsky had, interestingly enough, and this is something you see in Karpovich as well, Kluchevsky had written about Ukraine and Kostomarov especially Kostomarov, in his personal writings, and was fascinated by him. But in his overarching, in his published writings, there was more of an elision or an erasure of the Ukrainian point of view, and that was because he was prioritizing that central point of view. Karpovich also took this on, and one of his important articles was about Kluchevsky, actually, and he says, and this is I think 1943, Karpovich says that Kluchevsky provides the foundation for the study of Russian history. And in this and other things, he wrote down the kind of topics that ought to be studied. And when this article was published later on, it included the books that were actually written to fulfill those desired things by Karpovich. And for me, that was very interesting, because it's like the whole first generation of academic monographs, things that I remember studying as a grad student. So the vision of what are the gaps and what needs to be studied was very much driven by an understanding of what Kluchevsky had done. And interestingly, Alexander Kerensky, who most people know as the president of the leader of the provisional government, but who more relevantly for us here was the professor of Russian history at Stanford, said that it was very important to create a cadre of Americans, American by birth, culture, and taste, who would have the point of view of Russia. Right? This is written, after Karpovich died, in his obituary that he wrote about him. And so what we see is that actually did take place. There was a whole generation who studied Russian history in a particular way, in a way that had been sort of set down by Kluchevsky. And, oftentimes when I've talked about this with Russian historians, they'll say, well, there were people who pushed back, there were people who didn't go along with it. Richard Pipes was also a student of Karpovich, which is true. And yet, if you look at the field as a whole, is still very much influenced by this point of view of looking at things through the question of what is the Russian state and what are the reasons of the state. And it's also very important because when you have centers of thought like Harvard, they're not just training the next generation of historians, but they're training the next generation of people in the government, people in the CIA, people in the State Department. I'm not going to list all the different divisions that are relevant. And so this is part of the reason for what Vitaly's talking about with the punditry, because the punditry is also shaped by this point of view, where the question so often is, what is the Kremlin thinking? What is Putin thinking? Right? That becomes this obsession, and that has a direct line back all the way to Karamzin. But Kluchevsky was the person who made it modern, right? Because he was very influenced by sociology, and he was writing at a time when that old-fashioned way of doing things that Karamzin did would no longer have cut the mustard. But the way Kluchevsky was able to do it, phrasing it within sociology, putting it forward as part of this national epic, it brought it into the modern world. So what's happened now is that all historians of Russia and the United States who, got their training here can basically trace their lineage back to Karpovich and therefore to Kluchevsky. And every Russian historian that I've spoken to can do this. I myself am just 3 generations removed from Kluchevsky. And that makes it difficult for people to question the frame, right? Because it's not so much about requiring certain content, right? It's not about content exactly. It's more like, what is the frame? What is structure of the textbook? Does the structure of the textbook begin with Kiev and Rus and then never talk about Ukraine again? Yeah, a lot of times it does. I just looked at an edited volume that was published this year, and that's what they do, right? It starts with Kiev and Rus and Muscovy, and they're on in. So when someone is formed intellectually, there's often a moment in that process of forming, there's more flexibility, right? But oftentimes, sadly, after that process of forming, there tends to be less flexibility. So the question is, knowing all of this, what do we do? And I have to admit, I don't really know the answer, because what I've been struck by when talking about this with my Russian historian colleagues is sort of the unwillingness to engage with this. One of my colleagues said, "Oh, you just think there's a Kluchevsky virus," which is not really fair, but I guess in a way is a reflection of this idea that there is this thing that still remains. There is this influence that still has come down over the years and is still around. And it's hard. It's hard to go back to fundamentals, and it's hard to relearn those fundamentals. but I think that it's the only way to have any of that epistemic justice that Vitaly was talking about. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Just to have one quick observation. I mean, another reason why it's so important to focus on Karpovich and Harvard specifically is because of the centrality of the Davis Center and the Russian Research Center at Harvard in the creation of the profession of Russian historians in the United States. And that's something that historians who are trained in the U.S. Have to learn. They learn historiography. So, from epistemic injustice to the history, now we'll come back to the contemporary scene, and we'll hear from Professor Oksana Sheve, who will talk about Russia and Ukraine, entangled histories, diverging states, which of course is the title of her new book, co-authored with Maria Popova. Dr. Sheve.
Thank you very much, Markian. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to speak at this symposium. So what I want to do today, I want to introduce to all of you the main argument in this book that my colleague Maria and I have just published. The book is out in electronic version already, and is out in Europe, and is going to be out in paper version in the US in January. If anybody is maybe interested in purchasing it, there is a 30% discount code that the publisher gave me that I'll share towards the end. So what I want to do today, Vitaly, if you want to go next slide.
It did advance there.
Oh, it did. Okay, great. Yes. So I want to introduce a part of the main argument in the book, which is basically about the root causes of the war, and what we argue that it has not been really the conflict between Russia and NATO, and Russia is not Russia's fear about its security, and that NATO enlargement kind of prompted it to react to, but instead it is this 30-year growing divergence between the two countries, and in the book we go over specifics in this divergence, primarily in the two areas, in the politics of identity and in the political reforms. The regime type, I'm going to be talking more about identity in this talk, but in the book that we do address divergence in the political regime. And then we argue that basically this divergence has proceeded and increased in what we call...
Sorry, I just did something. I was trying to...
Yeah. So it proceeded and increased in what we call an escalatory cycle. And eventually the cycle culminates in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And so specific collision is between what we call Ukraine's commitment to independence, which was realized through a certain set of identity politics, and Russia's increasing imperialization. So again, I'll talk a little bit about what kind of specific things that we have in mind there. And then the last point here, which again is discussed more in the book than I'll have time to cover today, is that to the extent that the West could have or should have done something different, it would be not kind of greater accommodation towards Russia, as some realists have advocated, or towards its supposedly legitimate security concerns, but it should have been more containment of Russia and engagement with Ukrainian kind of pro-Western aspirations sooner. But I won't get to talk about it that much today. Although if there is interest, we can address that in Q&A. Now, what I want to sort of preface before I get to the details, also saying that even though we do talk about Russian imperialism, it is not kind of an argument, or at least we hope that it wasn't sort of the simplistic argument that Russia was always imperialistic and look what happens. We consider various what we call counterfactuals in the book, basically various sets of circumstances that, had events developed differently, invasion perhaps could have been avoided, right? So Russia may have been, remained imperialist country, but it doesn't mean that the war was in that way preordained. So I'll hopefully have a little bit of time to address that. So why don't we? Yeah, okay. So basically, our story starts with the late Soviet period because we trace the beginning of this divergence, the start of this escalatory cycle, to the last years of the Soviet Union. The 1990 elections, if you remember the ones that Gorbachev organized, were the first competitive elections to the local legislatures. So when Ukrainian Rada gets elected, Ruch gets about 25% of the vote, and then the rest, the majority of the parliament are the Communist Party. So that was different, for example, from the Baltic states, where pro-sovereignty movements gained outright majority in this election. In Ukraine, they didn't, but they established substantial presence. And then, very importantly, the communist majority essentially splits, and that split grew, in the years as the Soviet state was weakening, and eventually leading to the collapse in 1991. And a part of the communist elite that got interested, pretty much for self-interested reasons, in greater sovereignty and their possibility that it opened up for political and economic power, essentially not taking orders from Moscow, and also kind of responding to the new dynamics domestically that it was introduced by free election, essentially concludes this, what Andrew Wilson has aptly called the grand bargain, with the National Democrats on the right. So we use kind of his term of the grand bargain, which basically refers to the kind of interest in sustaining and developing first sovereignty and later full-scale independence, and in that sense, they're allied with the political right, sort of center-right nationalist national democrats. And then, if we now think to the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, and sort of how Ukraine and Russia viewed it differently, there is really divergence, we argue in the book, and anybody who wants some evidence of this, we really rely on Professor Plokhy's excellent book about the waning years of the Soviet Union, where he really explains how Yeltsin, for all of his struggle with Gorbachev and kind of using sovereignty of the Russian Republic essentially as a tool, collapse of the Soviet Union was not in the interest of Russian Democrats. That was sort of not what they wanted to bring about. Essentially, Yeltsin at the time reconciles to it because after, of course, Ukrainian independence referendum produced this massive vote in favor of independence. Preservation of the Soviet Union was not on the agenda then, but already at that point there are very different expectations as to what the future holds. So Kravchuk famously calls the collapse of the Soviet Union and the formation of this Commonwealth of Independent States as a civilized divorce. And really Russia views it, including Russian Democrats, as a possibility of sort of, yes, we are kind of parting ways, but that's going to be temporary. There's going to be some sort of greater integration, not necessarily recreation of some communist state, of course. I mean, Yeltsin and his allies were anti-communist, but some sort of growing political integration in the not too far future. And there is sort of this fundamental difference of what collapse of the Soviet state was really about. So let's go to the next slide. Right. So again, this center-right grand bargain, as we discussed in the book, was basically as an alliance, informal. It was never sort of formalized, but the situation alliance between the forces ideologically committed to Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. Ruch and the allies were the main group in the 1990s, and the policies that they wanted to pursue to strengthen Ukrainian nationhood and statehood. Anything to do, things with such as language legislation. Ukrainian is the only state language. The commitment to avoiding, by all means possible, dual citizenship with Russia, because again, sort of dual citizenship was seen as blurring the boundaries between Ukrainian and Russian nation, kind of paving a way to potential future political unity, which is exactly what Russia wanted. And also history, politics, and all these kind of other humanitarian, we can say, policies. So essentially the center goes along with it. Again, as we argue, and other scholars have also made this argument before, it was really kind of more self-interest on the part of these former communist elites. They were not, people who were dissidents in the 60s, and many of them, like Kravchuk himself, spent his career fighting Ukrainian nationalism, right? And then they sort of jump on this bandwagon of sovereignty because they now see the possibility, including for economic enrichment from privatization. And the right sort of like closes their eyes on this. So that was kind of part of the bargain, that the center would get to do whatever it is they wanted to do pretty much in the economy, which led, was not the only, but was one of the factors that results in various sort of corrupt privatization deals, the oligarchs and so forth, as long as they are committed to this agenda of state and nation building that the right really cared about. Now, and in this, so this language and citizenship policies are particularly important, and Russia really doesn't like what's going on in Ukraine. So through the 1990s, they try very hard, but unsuccessfully, to convince Ukrainians to agree to dual citizenship with Russia and or some common citizenship in this Commonwealth of Independent States, which again many see in Russia a hope to become the basis for the growing political unity, in particular between Russia and Ukraine. And there is very strong resistance on the part of the Ukrainian elites, including these former communists, which again is very important. So this Russian attempt to bring this closer political integration fails as a result of this grand bargain. Now, so the counterfactual, so one of the counterfactuals we consider in the book, like what would have happened had political pluralism been sustained in Russia? So in Russia in the 1990s under Yeltsin, they don't like what's going on in Ukraine on this sort of nation-building front. But for a variety of reasons, they can't really do anything about it. Part of it is kind of state weakness. In general, there is disarray, economic crisis. Part of it that actually many in the Yeltsin entourage, they were not too preoccupied with kind of nation building, for lack of a better word, and the thinking was that if you can get economic reforms right, then Russia would become appealing as kind of the center of gravity for the post-communist countries, so even for the post-Soviet republics. So even if your goal is kind of imperial in that sense, you don't really need to do much about it, right? That's of course, later that line of thinking will be abandoned. But we consider the possibility, right? Like had somebody maybe either other than Putin been selected as Yeltsin's successor, had Yeltsin lived longer, had been basically some kind of political competition survived in the post-Yeltsin period, what would have been the consequences for the bilateral relations? And we argue, again, this is counterfactual, that didn't come to pass. But potentially you can sort of imagine that even if there was the strong imperialist tendencies in the part of Russian elites, there would have been disagreements about how to achieve the goal, right? Like, would you try to build a liberal empire? That was another idea at the time. Chubais advocates this, some sort of like based on a successful economic reform, right? They may have disagreed about methods. So again, sort of this, what would happen if first in 2014 and then in 2022 when Putin sends this armada across the border, right? We argue it would have been less likely, if there has been greater political competition in Russia, even if imperialism remained in there. So let's go to the next slide, right? So sort of kind of going forward in time, the consequences and sort of this growing divergence in the subsequent years since Putin comes to power in Russia. We specifically focus in the book on these two periods what we call critical junctions, where really the divergence accelerates substantially, and again, kind of hypothetical counterfactuals that could have reduced this divergence don't come to pass. So the first one is the Orange Revolution, and what we see between sort of beginning of the independence period in early 90s and early 2000s, by the time of the Orange Revolution, is this gradual shifts in the public opinion in Ukraine. So this notion, of course, Ukraine votes overwhelmingly for independence in December 1991, but then because of the economic crisis, many sort of hopes for this great economic improvement as a result of independence, which many, and surveys actually from the time showed that many people who voted for sovereignty and independence, they did not necessarily vote for it kind of for ideological reasons, but for expectations that it would bring economic improvement. I remember there were these leaflets that kind of showed how much France produced and how much Ukraine produced in like milk and meat and so forth. And sort of the idea was that we'll become like France very quickly. That of course doesn't come to pass. And then there is this, the electoral preferences kind of, were quite pro-Russian, let's be honest, in the 1990s. Things such as dual citizenship with Russia had majority popular support, right? Some sort of political, do you want to integrate with the EU, with Russia, majority, not huge majority, but still majority, favored Russian integration. And that's how, for example, Kuchma comes to power on this pro-Russian ticket, essentially. But then, of course, he doesn't fulfill any of the electoral promises, because then, again, of this center-right elite grand bargain, they want to run independent state, not a province of Moscow, so they kind of, get elected, but then don't deliver. But then and what is forgotten in this, elite picture is that how gradually, but still very importantly, there has been actually changes going on in society. So this argument that Ukraine was always deeply divided between East and West, and this is like the blue and yellow here at the electoral map of 2004, which, is very stark and of course has been used many times. But if you look at where pro-Western parties were winning on the party list vote, you actually see the sort of divide moving from East to West. So in other words, kind of the pro-Western, for lack of a better word, or anti-Russian, if you want, constituency was slowly growing because of the changes in the center. And by 2002, the parliamentary election of 2002, that's of course after the Kuchma-gate scandal with the Melnichenko tapes, Yushchenko's Our Ukraine party for the first time, right, like wins actually majority on the party list vote. They end up not getting majority in the parliament because of the single member district, but they win majority. And this basically the alliance, the center-right alliance, elite alliance, begins to break because basically the right is getting stronger as time goes by, and the left is getting weaker. And then, of course, we have the Orange Revolution. Let's go to the next slide. So the Orange Revolution as an important critical junction in this divergence cycle, because of course, Yushchenko comes to power, very much, not the candidate Putin had preferred. And then once he's elected, he begins to pursue policies that are kind of stronger, we can say, on pro-Western / pro-Ukrainization agenda that Kuchma has been pursuing during his tenure. So this is the time when Holodomor is recognized as a genocide, so the law is passed to this effect. Yushchenko also attempts unsuccessfully to promote kind of rethinking and retelling of the history of the Second World War, in particular Ukrainian nationalist organizations as fighters for freedom as opposed to Nazi collaborators with a Soviet characterization. He, of course, also announces Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations to join the EU and NATO. Right, and again, sort of this identity shift in the geographic center continues because already by the end of Yushchenko tenure, for example, majorities of the population now does agree that Holodomor was genocide of the Ukrainian people, which was not, the case, say, in the 1990s. And again, kind of the counterfactual we're considering here: what would have happened had Yushchenko, say, died from dioxin poisoning? This divergence, again, it's not a given. But one could sort of think about that, if Yanukovych were to become president in 2004, perhaps this divergence could have been halted, right? In other words, Yanukovych maybe could have delivered Ukraine to Russia, for lack of a better word, and had longer time to consolidate both authoritarian regime, sort of similar to what Putin was building in Russia, right? And actually not pursue these kinds of policies that Yushchenko pursued on foreign policy and nation building front in particular, right? Now, of course, what happens in Russia, because Russia has this kind of imperialist lens that my colleagues talked about viewing Ukraine, Putin does not really consider what happens in 2004 in Ukraine as really a culmination of very complicated domestic politics in Ukraine, which of course what it was Ukraine without Kuchma and Gangadze and all of these oligarchs' disagreements and all of these things. He really sees it as some kind of Western plot, right, and aimed against Russia. So we sort of flipped the argument of this Russia-West collision, like yes, it existed, but the causes of it really were not security and NATO expansion, but Ukraine really parting its ways, and really turning in the direction Russia does not want, which was, we argue, due to domestic political reasons in Ukraine and not due Western meddling, but that's not how Putin sees it. So Russia-West relations sours as a result of this continued and growing disagreement with Ukraine. So, and then additionally, that's also the time period when imperialization begins to increase in Russia. So from Helge Blakisrud very aptly describes it as narrowing in and widening up. And what he means by it, that within Russia, sort of this concept of Ruski as opposed to Rossiyski gets stronger. That we see, for example, Russification of indigenous minorities and things sort of emphasizing the Russianness of the Russian state. And simultaneously, this concept of the Ruski Mir, Russian world, is developed, which defines as Russia this broader territory, of course, including Ukraine. Right, so this kind of imperialization is increasing, which is very much in contrast to what Yushchenko is doing in Ukraine. Let's go to the next slide. So again, just to show that this is the opinion of Ukrainians on whether or not Holodomor was genocide, and you see already in 2010, majority says that it was. Right, so that's and that's again, we see these changes in the geographic center first before they reach the south and the east. So this regional divide is still there, but there's a lot of going on in identity front that is not, captured by this very binary east-west difference in Ukraine. Let's go to the next one. So again, so we're fast forwarding now to Yanukovych presidency. Potentially, it again could have been, that's yet another counterfactual. Maybe that was the last chance to reverse this or halt this divergence, and potentially a chance for Putin to achieve what he wanted, some kind of integration of Ukraine into this Ruski Mir without violent conflict, had Yanukovych done what he wanted him to do in Ukraine. And Yanukovych goes quite a long way. So there is both kind of regime convergence, that Yanukovych is really building authoritarian regime very similar to, on the model that Putin is saying. Political opposition is in prison, Tymoshenko, of course, right, the political parties, court staffing, like all of these judicial independence is weakened. So this growing autocratization, right? He, of course, also pursues much more kind of pro-Russian foreign policy with the Kharkiv Accord, removing a goal of NATO accession from Ukrainian constitution, although not the EU accession, importantly, right, as he continues to try to negotiate this EU association agreement. And then also in identity politics, this 2012 infamous Kivalov-Kolesnichenko language law that elevates the status of Russian, very much what Russia has been demanding. Right? And he also reverses some of the memory politics. Holodomor is redefined as a common tragedy of Soviet people, as opposed to genocide of the Ukrainian people. Although again, he doesn't cancel the law, but kind of the official discourse has changes. So the counterfactual he has to consider, right? What would have happened, right, had Yanukovych stayed in power? Had Maidan not succeeded in ousting him, could he have kind of again delivered Ukraine to Putin, for lack of a better word? It certainly wouldn't have been easy, but again, that was, we go in the book as a hypothetical possibility that maybe this, again, diverging cycle could have been stopped. I personally don't think it's very likely. I think the opposition would have been too strong for him to succeed, but again, as a hypothetical possibility. So, which sort of we are now coming to the let's go forward. In the right, so I don't know what happened to the title here. Basically, kind of the Russian how escalatory cycle now leads to more aggressive Russian military action, specifically against Ukraine. So basically, once Yanukovych is ousted, Putin concludes that these kind of peaceful methods, to try to bring Ukraine into Russian fold has failed, and he has now escalates to military methods. So we have annexation of Crimea, Russian involvement in the Donbass separatist or Russian-instigated conflict in Donbass, right? But at the same time, right, in Ukraine, these backfires. So now the public opinion is even more strongly anti-Russian. So we see that, I'll show in a second, just very briefly, opinion polls on EU integration, on NATO integration, on its strengthened Ukrainian identity, and that now also increases in the areas of the south and east of Ukraine. So this escalatory cycle is really kind of in hyperdrive. So let's go to the next slide. So just to show some of these changes. So for example, on the identity as a citizen of Ukraine is up a lot, right? So this is now the main identity of the majority of the Ukrainian population. Let's go to the next one. The membership in the EU, right, has been pretty close. Yes, EU was always popular, but really increases quite a lot after 2014. And on NATO, it's the most profound changes. We see essentially the lines flipping to the right, and you can go to the next one. You can see also by region. So this is now majority of the opinion in the historically friendly to Russia southeastern regions. So let's go just quickly through this since I'm out of time. So again, we can see this also changes in the language use, and very importantly on the attitudes towards Second World War Ukrainian nationalist formations. It's now agreement, including, paradoxically, probably Bandera himself never dreamed that in the south and east of Ukraine, yes, they agree that these groups were fighting for Ukrainian independence and should be categorized as such. In the legislature. So sort of the implications, and then again, so once basically Minsk agreements is the last possibility for Putin to achieve vassalization of Ukraine without full-scale invasion through the so-called special status. So if these regions were given so-called special status, ill-defined, but as Russia understood it, essentially veto power over decisions of the central government of Ukraine, that would have been again kind of made Ukraine constrained to do anything Putin doesn't want. Of course, Ukrainian political class, including Zelensky, sees that. They refuse to do this, and we are now into the full-scale war. So, the last 3 points to conclude. So Ukraine indeed becomes anti-Russia in that sense, as Putin says. But again, ironically, it is in no small part due to Putin's own policies, especially after 2014. This notion that there could be some sort of land for peace deal, I think it's really wrong, because what Russia really wants, and it has been clear for anybody who would sort of look at the evidence unbiasedly, to control all of Ukraine. It's not about controlling any specific piece of Ukraine. It is really a way, to vassalize Ukraine, to, its denial of Ukrainian statehood, of Ukrainian nationhood, and that's very clear, again, to Ukrainians. Unfortunately, it's not very clear to many people in the West to this day, so again, we would say that any kind of this territorial compromise would not bring either lasting peace, nor is it something that Ukrainians would agree to. And then, of course, sort of now we are in this long possibility for the long war, and these three things, I mean, this is not something that's in the book because the book was written earlier, but if we kind of think with implications for today, what might happen going forward, we would have to be looking at kind of domestic unity or lack thereof in Ukraine, what happens in Russia politically and economically, and what happens in the West as far as continued commitment to Ukraine. So that's our end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shevchenko. Our final speaker today, and I want to remind you to have some questions in mind when we come to the end, and we'll have a discussion. Our final speaker is George Grabovich, who needs no introduction, is former president of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, and his talk is titled, "Is Cancel Culture the Answer to Russia's War on Ukraine?" Professor Grabovich.
Well, thank you for this. For inviting me and for this opportunity to talk. I've done this talk at least once before, and I've made several written essays on attempting to articulate it, but I'm not sure I have it all down, and certainly in the panoply of presentations that we heard today, it is somewhat close to what Vitaly was speaking about epistemic inadequacy, if not exactly injustice. But what I want to focus on is the way that this relates to Ukrainian studies and to Russian studies and to the interrelation of these two disciplines. And in a sense, I'm reprising or going over things that I spoke of at ATSES in Philadelphia a few days ago. But it's not exactly only about that, it's more pointed maybe. In any case, in order to get the sense of what is going on, I mean, let me just state again, which everyone knows here and has heard before, but just to see how stark the issue is, because that's how Oksana Shevel concludes her talk. It's not a very optimistic prognosis that she is setting forth. So let me put it even more starkly. You know, what we have is an openly genocidal war, which is about destroying Ukraine, its culture, and Ukrainian studies, and these very things that we've all been doing, at least I've been doing for most of my adult life. To not see this is to be either asleep or somehow inadequate. That's one thing. The other thing is that this is still an ongoing intellectual issue, if this can be called intellectual, because, for example, in Russia, just this year, there appears a book called «Об историческом единстве русских и украинцев», published by the Russian Academy of Sciences, which is basically, it's called Dokumenty, you know, the subtitle that is, and it's basically taking Putin's speech, which is in a sense is the kind of blueprint for the invasion, and documenting it and proving that it is correct in every instant across the whole 1,000-year-old history of these two supposed, brotherly nations. And of course, as he's not here, but he said it very nicely, that even though the document is about said unity, that it is Ukrainians and Russians, the Ukrainians are supposed to become Russians, not Russians Ukrainians. That is what is at issue here. So what is confronting us is how do we deal with this in an academic setting? Can one deal with it in an academic setting? Because in Ukraine, basically they have taken, if by they we can say the state, and I'm sorry I'm blocking you. The state and most Ukrainian practitioners of Ukrainian studies have taken the line that the Russian side is to be boycotted, if not canceled right out. Now, if you think that this is a gross misconception of things, let me say that, as you all know, at some very early stage of the war, the Union of Rectors of Russian universities, all 304 of them, signed a letter saying that they fully support the war. the invasion. And then a few days later, literally a couple of days later, the Davis Center at Harvard said that in response to this, we can't deal with you. So they basically canceled at least the relationship between their center, the Davis Center, and these Russian universities. So it is going on. That is to say, a form of. There are obviously various other efforts, and I don't need even to mention them. I mean, this may come up in the discussion. But here is the issue as if I can, recast it this way. How does one deal with good Russians? That is how the Ukrainian side is positing. And what do they mean by good Russians? The people who profess to support Ukraine, or the people who actually have rethought their understanding of the Ukrainian-Russian relationship. In Ukrainian studies, this notion of canceling or boycotting is an immediate imposition, if you will, of a priori political or administrative limits or restrictions. Simply, it's a state policy. It has gone so far as to signal the fact that you cannot use Russian sources, which is, on the face of it, anti-scholarly. If you think that, again, that this is totally egregious, you might be reminded that during the war, British German studies were not focused on German studies, but on how to defeat Nazi Germany. So the context does determine some things, even though, as you know, several presidents of universities have gotten in trouble for saying that maybe too lightly. I also don't want to go into, but I think that most of us here understand that Slavic studies in this country is primarily Russian studies. So the whole question of a distortion in that discipline is rather self-evident. The questions that I see for myself is how to discuss subsequently the response of Russian studies to this predicament. My general sense, I was talking about this just yesterday with one of my close colleagues, is that and unfortunately I cannot speak about this with full certainty because I have been for the last 2 years or 3 years retired. So I don't have daily contact with my Russianist colleagues in the Slavic department. But I still see them periodically, and I can still tell that they are shell-shocked. And the question of how to deal, to articulate the differences between Ukrainian studies and Russian studies is hampered both by the attitude of Ukrainian studies that I have already signaled, at least in Ukraine, and the fact that the Russian counterparts, or Russianists in this country, are in a state of shock. If I'm wrong, then I certainly would like to hear that to be corrected and instances given. There are some elements within the attitude that predated the war that suggest attempts at coming to terms with it, but in a flawed and perhaps intrinsically fallacious way. I have in mind the notion of Russia colonizing itself, and thereby, in a sense, preempting the idea of it being, a colonial power. We were talking about, of course, Alexander Etkin's, internal colonization, a work that that has some very interesting and striking points to make, but which has an exculpatory message, as it were, or at least one that is read that way, and suggests that there is nothing to apologize for because we did it to ourselves. Maybe, I don't know. But at the most recent conference at ETSI's, which I mentioned just now, Halina Hreň, who was a participant in a panel that dealt with Ukrainian studies and Russian studies implicitly, brought out the point that it's not so much colonialism that we are talking about, but imperialism, which is a more virulent form, perhaps, of the former. So the question then is, who does one talk to? How does one talk to people? In a recent article that is about to be, that has not yet appeared, but is about to be published in Kritika, at least on the internet site, Luta, what's her first name? Ostrovska Luta writes about the fact that we can identify, indeed, good Russianists. And the example she gives is Tetiana Tlayirova-Yakovleva, who is a Ukrainianist, recently spoke, actually, not that that makes her the good scholar she is, but she recently spoke at Harvard. And one can see from, and of course lost her job and had to emigrate, but one sees a person who does this not for any ulterior motives, and certainly not for any kind of a political exigency, but simply as a Russianist, a Russian historian, writing about, doing research on Ukrainian and Russian interactions in the historical past. What are the strategies for engaging Russianists and continuing this in a positive way? If cancel culture, that by the way is a buzzword. It's not an effective sort of term to use. Boycott maybe is more objective. If that is not an effective way, because that is simply anti-scholarly. Scholarship does not boycott things. It suggests that we, as Ukrainianists working in the West, are obliged to do for Ukrainians what they themselves are, in a sense, too shell-shocked or too involved, to do. If that is the case, then all kinds of mechanisms and representational roles need to be examined in that scenario. It's again not a welcome task in some regard. Are there any preconditions that have to be put to our counteragents, to the people one wants to discuss? For example, the question was put, how does one discuss Ukrainian history with people who claim that Crimea is Russian, or ought to be Russian? It's a problem. The whole question of typologies and manners of dealing in this dialogue or hopeful dialogue is are there and are fraught. We heard about in your talk, Susan, about the rather continuous history of Russian historiography. And yet some of the participants in that, the name of Richard Pipes was mentioned, are again problematic, because Pipes was more Polish than he was Russian, and he was also Jewish, so this is a matter of of cultural perception. I am not, I have only alluded to some of the issues that are involved. I think that the role that is being placed upon us, upon this institution, and upon us as scholars in this field is existential almost, because it is for the survival of the field too. And I don't see any particularly easy answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our four distinguished speakers. What I'd like to do is maybe give a chance to collect a couple of questions and comments, and maybe to start the conversation. And of course, there's so much for all of us to think about that we'll continue the conversation even after the panel formally closes. So let's collect a few questions. Okay, I see Margarita Balmaceda.
Can we get started?
Yeah.
Yes. So I have a comment for Professor Grabovich and maybe a question for Professor Chernetsky. Starting from the last point about pipes, when I was a teenager, I happened to be in one of the last Pipes-Cohen debates at Princeton. And I can tell you that even if you disagree with the policy associated with that state, you can still think of a certain epistemological centering as Moscow-centered. So you can be critical of Moscow-centeredness, but still be Moscow-centered, and that's exactly what I have observed in all my work about energy politics. And a question for Professor Chernetsky. I loved the way in which you brought in all different disciplines into the discussion of epistemological injustice and so on. I'm fainting here because it's very hot. But and I was wondering how much that could be used to build also bridges within Ukraine. So, for example, the entire time that I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about my own experience of otherness as a Latina, as a gay person, and I was thinking, obviously, the Latina issue is not so central in Ukraine, but how could similar issues be used to building a space also for marginalized discourses within Ukraine itself? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a question from Alex Ritzak.
I would like to sort of ask in a similar kind of spirit to hear all the panelists talk about what it is that complicates a kind of rapprochement with Russian studies, and I mean by that, what are the institutional factors that may prevent people from engaging in a dialogue or in a sort of shift of everything that they think about what they were studying their whole life? Like, how do you get people to be willing to question their most basic and fundamental assumptions? And I'll just say, the reason I'm asking that is, at the University of Chicago, there were two major Soviet and Russian historians, and Sheila Fitzpatrick, for reasons of her career, very much was pro-Soviet in her vision of Russian history, and she, her party line with her students, who were my age, was that there was no totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. There was modernization, and the modernization built bridges and streets and schools. It was this benevolent view of, uplift and civilization of the non-Western or non-Russian peoples. The Soviet Union as a great civilizer and modernizer. And then there was Ron Suney, whose book, Revenge of the Past, was about the ways in which sort of the harmful practices of imperialism had come back to bite the Soviet Union on the butt, and that they had now, they now had the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when I came to him saying I was going to do my doctoral work in Ukraine and I wanted to study national identity formation with him using his social history approach, etc., using an institutional approach, not like just a history of ideas approach, which is a little bit different, he just replied, well, if you're like every other Ukrainian I've ever met in my entire life, and this is a man of close to 60 years old, I don't want to work with you. That was all. And even recently, he wrote in the in the Moscow, emigre press, Moscow Post, that until the full-scale invasion happened, he had never believed Ukraine to be a colony. And, I don't know how you change, I don't know how you engage with those people. I've tried to engage with them, and they just trivialize everything that I have to say to them.
Okay, and one more quick question? Okay, yes, sir.
I'm not in Ukrainian studies. I'm a comparative historical sociologist disinterested in Ukraine, right? So I think that the only way of getting out of this dilemma, how to decolonize without falling into methodological nationalism. We know that all our sciences were born in the 19th century, and methodological nationalism is the base of all of it. All of them are trying to get out of methodological nationalism. So the problem for Ukraine now is, Ukrainian studies, is that we cannot then impose methodological nationalism now when all the social science and history are trying to go beyond. So I think that only by somehow, through comparative context, where you basically deal, if you deal with any issue with Ukraine, with comparison with, obviously, colonization, then comparison with Ireland, or comparison with India, or comparison, so only in this sense, you can really avoid falling into methodological nationalism, I would add.
Okay. I think we should give our panelists a chance to respond. Would someone like to?
I would defer to
Okay.
Vitaly, I think. Yeah.
All right, I'll start, and obviously I'll be happy for colleagues to contribute. Thank you so much, everyone. These are all very important issues. I would say that from what Margarita said, we actually see change happening in Ukraine precisely because of the radical authoritarian turn in Russia and the scapegoating of diversity and of basically purging Russia of all who think otherwise, but also of representatives of various minority identities. As we know, Russia recently passed this shocking decision declaring a global LGBT movement an extremist organization, according to the Russian law. What we see that Ukraine actually, precisely, it's the idea of what are we fighting for? What are we defending? In response to the full-scale invasion, it created a change within Ukrainian society, and this is not just for the younger generation, which was already more exposed to ideas of diversity, but also to folks who were older and perhaps more set in their ways, who were less willing to open their hearts, and they have changed. We see that, for instance, the attitude, because of Ukrainian LGBTQ persons fighting on the front line and giving their lives for Ukraine, that the attitude towards folks in same-sex relationships really changed, and we see progress in terms of acceptance, in terms of moving towards legal recognition, because there's a very practical things. What happens if one of the members of the family is wounded at the front line in the hospital? What happens if one is killed, and who gets to be the survivor benefits? So so we see that changing. Also, in terms of engagement of people of color within Ukraine, this has really changed. There's a wonderful blogger, Alisa Zholaveri, who herself is Afro-Ukrainian, who's been spotlighting that, but not the only one. Philip, I forget his last name, a young man of Nigerian Ukrainian from Kharkiv who just died at the front line. The tributes that we saw to him. And that was incredibly moving and showing how the society is changing. The same goes for representatives of all the other sort of diverse communities. So the war, which usually, but stereotypes, rallying around the flag, suggests in political science analysis, making the countries more unitary in a bad sense, as in less respectful of diversity, less willing to embrace it, is doing precisely the opposite, I would argue, in the case of Ukraine, and opening it to diversity. In terms of the experiences that Ala encountered, I've had my very complicated dialogue with Ron Sunni too, and we were both guests of honor in Tartu in June of last year, and he was very uncomfortable, but was trying to, at least in some polite ways, to understand that things are different. There are some other folks who were not granting Ukraine a chance. I would mention, for example, Madina Tlastanova, who became a prominent decolonial theorist, left Russia, now is based in Sweden, who basically was saying, talking about Russia as a colonial empire in cases of Caucasus and Central Asia is legitimate, but it does not make sense to talk about Ukraine, who in her early work has said a lot of unpleasant anti-Ukrainian things, and who basically made her gesture of apology. But in general, we have a big problem is that a lot of people from Russia who are either left Russia or are still inside Russia because of family circumstances or otherwise, they are embarrassed. So they are staying silent or saying private messages of support, but they're embarrassed to actually enter a dialogue. So those who often try to enter the dialogue are actually combative or misguided people, but not the ones who are genuinely horrified and ashamed. They actually practice what some Ukrainians have called them to do, and that is yield the platform, let Ukrainian voices be heard, because otherwise in the global public sphere, they are continuing drowning out Ukrainian voices because they claim victimhood and oppression, and there in many cases are folks who Western institutions are more familiar with, and this perpetuates a problem. So what we need to do is engage those colleagues who say, thank you, we understand your shame and embarrassment, and we salute that. Let's talk about it, let's build bridges, but be very careful about those who are sucking all the oxygen out of it.
I mean, one thing I would want to say that kind of it's crossing the wires.
Sorry. Not at all.
Yeah, I actually think that when we look at the situation of scholars in Russia, we can't assume that it's a normal situation. And I think it's really similar to late Stalinism, actually. And I would refer everyone here to this excellent article, which is in The Future of the Soviet Past by Nikolai Petrov. And he's a dissident scholar, and he writes beautifully about how basically after 2014 it became impossible to do normal scholarship, which is a scholarship, right? And this is part of the reason why so much stuff is coming out, like you mentioned this, the Unity, colon documents, and I've seen a lot of stuff like that. So also I do think that actually the trying to continue scientific connections with people in Russia is a big part of the reason why Russian historians are silent. And I base this on my conversations with my colleagues. Those people who have not broken off their scientific work, I mean scientific in the sort of, Central European sense, work with people in Russia are afraid to criticize Putin because they fear harm coming to those people they're working with. So I actually think that it's a good thing to break off those connections, because otherwise you're afraid to speak out because you are connected to these people, and these people could be, in trouble. So I think there are some people who remain silent for those kind of fears, and I think there are a lot of people, and I'm talking about Americans who are Russian historians, and I think there are a lot of people who just wanted to go away. I think there are a lot of people who would prefer to go back to the way it was, because you didn't have to deal with these contentious kind of questions, and you could write about happier things, as it were. But I do think that part of it is a larger kind of problem of even the people who are relatively decent are afraid of saying the wrong thing. I think it's more important to come out and just say, look, this is not okay, this is not right. But, there's still people now who are worried about Russian visas. I mean, mentally, when the invasion happened, I just said I give up my Russian visa now, this moment, and forever, right? But there are lots and lots of my colleagues who are still thinking, maybe in the future I could get a Russian visa. I could go. I mean, there are people going to Russia right now doing archival research, which blows my mind. But it is happening. So I think that there's a lot of responses, and there's a lot of reasons why many Russians just would prefer to remain silent. I see it more as a moral kind of issue, but I think for a lot of people it's more like, what is more comfortable, right? So if you have the question, what is more comfortable, you have a very different answer than what is moral, right? So I think those are the contending questions. I do think that there are people who can be reached, but Vitaly's right. I mean, he's talking about Russians in Russia. I'm talking about Americans here who are Russianists. It's got to be careful, and it's got to be sort of targeted, and it's not going to be easy. Is my thought. So, who's next?
Thank you. I was just going to very quickly comment, Alex, on your question about what to do potentially with these people who have certain views and how do you convince them and so forth. I don't think. I mean, again, this is just my opinion. I think that you can't really convince them, but I think by engaging in conversation and challenging their preconceptions, you can sort of maybe convince the people who are listening to these discussions, right? Because if Fitzpatrick says, Soviet Union was this great modernizing project, sure, but at what cost, right? So if somebody is hearing this argument, and then you have voices, from Ukrainian, Central Asian people, others who would, talk about the cost of this modernization program, right? Like in some sense, Germany was a modernizing project too, but we are not celebrating that. We are not celebrating UK colonialism in, Africa and elsewhere because it was modernizing. So I think these sorts of discussions with facts, I think has a potential to sway the audience if the people themselves are not going to be swayed after 30 whatever year careers that they had or more. And in a way with Suni, we had this conversation at ACES because he, for reasons that are really puzzling me, given that he's a scholar of nationalism, he seems to think, and he actually admitted it at this panel, and then a lot of people spoke again with evidence, kind of pushing against this argument, that maybe Putin doesn't really want to destroy Ukraine. Maybe he would be satisfied with just getting these 4 territories and
building some more roads.
Exactly, right? And yes, he said all of these other things, but why should that's probably not what he means. What kind of analysis is this? Why should we dismiss what he says, right? They keep saying it repeatedly. There is no evidence whatsoever to say that he wants something else, right? And several people, at this panel when this question was raised, kind of, said that. So again, maybe Suni will continue to say how, Putin doesn't really maybe want to destroy Ukraine. But I think whoever heard this exchange in the audience hopefully would come out of this more prepared. So again, it goes to the question Professor Grabovich was raising, how do we deal, and Vitaly, right? How do we deal with engaging with people who are maybe set in their views that perhaps we think they shouldn't be holding so far. And it's not an easy question, but I think at least in these Western forums, where I think people are forced to keep professional appearances, to kind of present their views in a ways that would encourage conversation, as opposed to just sort of propaganda that you can type on Twitter when you are not, right? So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Just one word, and this is maybe saying the obvious, but humanities cannot deal without being moral. You have moral values, you have moral issues. Truth, and and the history of it, the history of paresia, what Foucault, emphasized, is actually an important cultural component, and you can't simply dismiss it.
So we did get started. So maybe one more quick round of questions and comments, and then if someone would like to respond, that would be okay, but then we'll have to bring the panel to a close. So, Yohanan?
Yeah, thank you. We are thinking out loud mostly about the academic audience, and I would like everybody present here to address 2 other audiences that are no less important. I'm invited every once in a while to West Providence Park, which is a big Orthodox Jewish community. They ask me what I do, and I'm saying I'm going to Lviv, where I'm teaching, and they are saying, "Oh, you are teaching those anti-Semitic?" They're using Yiddish for anti-Semites, and they say, "Okay, what else do you do?" I'm saying, "I'm going to Dnipro, and I'm teaching there." "Oh, you are teaching those anti-Semitic?" So there is this conceptualization that Vitaly quite nicely also presented through an example. That there is a conceptualization of Ukrainians as anti-Semites, and we need to dispel that particular view, and I'm doing that, investing my heart and nerve and sinew into that for years. But I would like to hear from you, how do you deal with that bias of the general Jewish community, very much anti-Ukrainian bias, which in our particular case works in favor of the Russian narratives? This is my first part of the same question. The second question, which is the second part of the first, is about something that we also heard here today in a very straightforward way. Who are the people? Who are those people who are contaminated? Excuse me for using your words, with Chernetsky's virus. There was a situation. Is Alex Motel here? I don't see him. So it was 2013 October. The students are already gathering on the Maidan, and I'm calling Motil. We are close with him for years, and he sponsored my first lectures at Harman Institute back in the 1990s. And I'm saying, Alex, this doesn't smell well. It would end badly. Do you have people on the Hill who we can contact and tell them they have to be very serious about what's going on in Ukraine? He says, I'll try to do that in November. So police starts, beating students. The Maidan brings in 900,000 to 1,200,000 people. Nobody counted. Nobody believes these numbers, but the numbers are astounding. And I'm calling Motil and I'm saying, it will end up very badly. Russia stopped. Russia did not do anything in 2004. Well, it did, but not in a direct way. But in this particular case, in 2013, they would not sit idle. Something has to be done. The State Department has to be warned. So Motil contacts his people, and these are the people with Khrushchevsky virus. And they do nothing. The response in December to us, to him and to me, we proposed to have a round table explaining the importance of what's going on in Ukraine. The response was silence. Remarkable reticence about what's going on. So then everybody knows what happens with the shooting of the Nebesna Sotnya. Then Russia starts invasion, the annexation of Crimea, invasion in the east. They do nothing, and these are the people who were trained by Karpovich and his ilk. Okay, Bruce Lincoln, Greg Fries, all those people who are saying that Russian project is a great civilizational project, and we Ukrainians, Jews, we are barbarians who need to, how do you talk to these people on the Hill? How do you make sure that their thinking tanks do get our stories? Okay, so forget about West Rogers Park. Let's talk about this. So these are two groups that really interest me, and I would like to find out, what do you think, how we can change their narratives?
Okay, and there's a couple more questions. So, Protsek, please.
I'm very pleased to hear the first two presentations, one from the theoretical point of view, the other from the historiographical point of view. However, in the second paper, I did not hear, was Khrushchevsky a good scholar? Considering the political conditions at that time, also his approach, could he have been a good scholar? In the Kerensky certainly was not a historian. He was a politician, as you had mentioned, and only a politician, as his book, History's Turning Point, very clearly indicates. But I do appreciate the fact that you mentioned that he was a politician and certainly quite influential here in the United States when we arrived. The third paper was an excellent overview of current Ukrainian history, but My impression is it did not belong to this panel. I was waiting for someone to mention what needs to be done. The fourth speaker did, but I'm shocked that the word canceling was mentioned. Or, so to speak, nationalistic history was even raised. After all, we are a scientific society. Of course we know what to do, but I would suggest that a second panel be organized to discuss this particular question. What needs to be done is work and work and further work, scholarly studies based on documents, based on documentation. This is what I expected to hear, and this is what I have always promoted, and this is what my written works testify to. We have a job to do. And no matter what our points of view are, we have to cooperate. We have to work together in libraries, in archives. It's not only how can we convince this or this person to become pro-Ukrainian. And such evaluations as that Pipes was Polish and Jewish. Does that mean that he cannot be an excellent historian? He was one of the best. And many students of my generation depended on his works. His lectures at Columbia, when he came occasionally here, were excellent, were the best. And I suppose that this was a very good beginning, a very good foundation for our next work. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to give two quick questions. One from you, sir, and one from
Hi, I'm Anthony Richter from the Open Society Foundation.
Speak up.
Anthony Richter, Open Society Foundations. I was interested in a common theme among all of the papers, which is a kind of dialogue between Ukraine and various imperial centers, whether Moscow or Washington, okay, we call it Harvard, but the problem for a question about an agenda for the future is not so much persuading imperial centers, but other centers which posit a relationship as colonial subjects themselves. And so Walter Mignolo, the Argentine scholar, the theoretician of decoloniality, supports Russia, saying that Putin's war is anti-Western and therefore anti-colonial. And it seems that there's an agenda of conversation and dialogue among scholars where Ukraine aspires to be, a part of Ukrainian scholarship seems to aspire to be understood as a colonial subject. Maybe there's an agenda of such dialogue with others in the continent of Africa, in the Arab world, and so problematic, this misunderstandings among scholars. Maybe there's some work to be done there. What do you think?
Okay, great.
Maria Genkin from Rasm from Ukraine. Actually, I want to go back to Professor Grabovich's talk and ask more questions about it, because it seems like we don't really know what to do with the narrative of all the Russians are the same and there are no good Russians coming out from Ukraine. And, having heard so much about also the anti-Semitic narrative that so often turned against us, isn't it very similar? And is it possible to kind of employ the fact that we're dealing with that stereotype to explain why all the Russians are the same is also hurting us, in propagating that? And my other question is actually coming back to ACES. I was at the panel that was on decolonizing Russian historiography that was very poorly attended, like not many Russian historians actually went there. But also the presenters there were sort of our allies. They were, more or less, thinking about decolonizing Ukraine. But also some of them, who were Russian historians, were very naive and very new to this. They were mentioning that they've been using different name for everything coming from Kiev Rus for 3 years, which is great, but Ukrainian historians obviously have done it for much longer. Can we somehow take the initiative and actually act not as, we just want them to do it, but actually teach them how to decolonize? Because clearly, Ukrainian historiography is a decolonized Russian historiography. So like we need to be have a little bit more agency in that conversation. And how can we do that?
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to ask whether our panelists might have a final response. We do have only a couple minutes before we have to close, but
so in one very practical answer to what Maria mentioned is Yale Macmillan Center is doing a series of things having to do with decolonizing the curriculum. I mean, it would be great to have Shevchenko Society working with Yale on that. They're doing a whole thing called Reesneys. I can get in contact with you, and Razin should be there. I was there. Vitaly was there. Vitaly knows all about it. But in any case, that's a practical thing. Was Kluchevsky a good historian? In the German sense of source studies, he was an extraordinary historian. He was a master at going back to the chronicles. He brought in many different things in terms of knowledge of the sources. He was sort of unparalleled. And so he had, that going for him. But he did have this blind spot on Ukraine. And he even mentioned that something like, we had to go away from talking about Ukraine because we were sailing in the mainstream, right? We were sailing in the mainstream of Russian history, which I think is a very telling kind of metaphor. But how do you engage with people? I mean, I think that you engage with Russian historians as much as you can. I mean, like through the Yale thing. And I also noticed that, at ACES it was fascinating because there were all the Ukrainians at the decolonizing panels and almost no Russian historians. And I would go to Russian history panels and it's all Russian historians who just do not go to the decolonizing panels. So it really is noticeable. Like at the big panel, it was just me and the Ab Imperio people. And the Ab Imperio people have been doing decolonization for a long time. So it's, so that it was not exactly, I mean, they're at least trying. I mean, I'm not going to say that they're perfect because,
but they will.
Yes, yeah. In any case, they've been interested in that. So those are just some platforms, and some people to talk to. So I don't know if those are
Thank you. These are all very valid questions. My answer to some of them for coalition building and things of that kind is actively seek out allies, and here it's scholars from Central Asia, I think, are among our best allies. I'm thinking of Balakovska Simbekova, for example, of the University of Basel, of Selby Durdeva, whom I mentioned, who's in Tübingen, and many others, Erika Marat, who's in Washington, D.C. So through them and through others, we can gradually build a coalition. Mignolo is a terrible problem. He basically thinks that Pax Americana is the problem with the world, and so he's actively cheering on Russia, China, and Iran. And you need to point this out to people, because a lot of people who have cited him have become very uncomfortable and gradually, I mean, I've cited him before too, and I just, I cannot do that even holding my nose. That influence perhaps explains Madina Tolstanova's position, because Mignolo was her big mentor in the Western world. So there are a lot of linkages in how theories travel. But yes, so the important thing is engaging younger colleagues. If you look at people who are writing their dissertations, who are fresh out on the job market, they do not hold those ossified Russocentric imperial views. They are our allies and they're the future of academia. So they do not yet have positions of power, but they will eventually. So engaging the younger generation, I think, is more important than arguing with Ron Sunnis.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to comment briefly on the question kind of how to speak to the non-academic audiences, and actually also on your question about this Western imperialism as opposed in Russian anti-imperialism. I found, maybe it's a little bit naive, but I found both in my interactions with students and in talking to non-academic audiences that oftentimes these sort of, what to us look like misconceptions or wrong views come kind of from lack of knowledge, right? So in other words, when somebody is like be it anti-Semitic towards Ukrainians, or think that whoever opposes, whoever Russia is opposes, and if say Western powers were imperialist, and here is Russia, opposing the West, therefore it is anti-imperial, just simply comes from lack of knowledge, right? Especially we're talking about non-scholars, that they don't, this notion that Russian empire, Russia was a colonial power and colonized all these different peoples, and you can have, colonialism both pro-Western and anti-Western. That's not a contradiction in terms. Sometimes it's not even something that just like occurred to a person, right? Or say if we think about like anti-Semitism, or this notion that there are all of these far-right, that there is a big threat of far-right nationalism in Ukraine. I mean, I find it helpful. Again, it's just my experience, and maybe, as I said, maybe a little bit naive, because obviously we're not going to convince any propagandist. I think that's kind of hopeless. But I think there are a lot of people there who simply are like unaware, right? So if I hear students say like, and sometimes not even students, I've given talks and somebody in the audience would say that like, oh, the biggest danger that Ukraine is facing is like increase in the power of the far right. Like, is this really the biggest danger, right? Like if Russia, were to somehow, advance more, they're going to be radicalization in Ukraine, and like all of these far right, people are going to do all these terrible things. It's not to say there is no far right in Ukraine, but like, is this really the biggest problem, right? Given, for example, what Russia is doing on the occupied territory, and when you invite people to think along those lines, not everybody, but some people, like I've had this experience talking even to people from the global south, they're like, oh, we didn't think about it this way, right? Like that's sort of that, yeah, there is a point there. So I think approaching it with sort of maybe like an open mind, and it's like, okay, tell me more, like why do you think that, right? And then you can sort of say, well, okay, so that's like one way of looking at it, but here are a few other things to consider, right, or some other facts to consider. And sometimes it works, right? Again, like we are not going to convince the propagandists, we're not going to convince Tucker Carlson and, all the other people of that ilk. But I think when it comes to, be it scholars from the developing world, the global south, right, be it undergraduate students who, read something, heard something, and they're kind of curious and, but they're not ideologues or partisans in this. They're really coming from the point, sometimes of ignorance, let's put it this way. I think we can actually make a big difference. So I'll try to, my comment on this more positive note.
I remember an aphorism that struck me as being very apt. When in doubt, contextualize. And you contextualize by comparing things, and that was mentioned, and that would be very helpful. And as far as stereotypes, yes, these need to be identified as such, and we have seen, for example, I found some interesting Polish studies on the nature of stereotypes, which goes back all the way to the Middle Ages too, and not just to the present. Anyway, it's there are so many things to comment on. I think I'll just stop and let us end.
I just want to one very brief comment, because I realized. Also, it's very important to understand that Russian propaganda directly targets the left as well as the right. And I could talk about that in more length to anybody who's interested. And that's been part of their practice for a long time. So it's not exactly a surprise that this is happening. Thank you.
So it's my unhappy task to bring this fascinating panel to a close. So let's thank our panelists, and thank you to all of you. To discussions in the sections, so we can bring all of this intellectual rigor to those discussions as well.